Hello, you're back with a single malt review, and today we have a single cask independent bottling of a rather rare old Highland whisky.
Yes, it is. This one comes somewhat courtesy of my partner. She turned 30 recently, and her birth year, 1987, was the one I sought out to find a whisky for. And this one here from Signatory was what I found. And neither of us are particularly disappointed. This one, I think, a real gem from quite an unknown distillery, but we'll see how it speaks to you.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of Glenturret out there. This one is
No,
September 1987, distilled, bottled in January 2017. So getting on towards 30, but not quite.
Glenturret's a bit of a funny one. There is Glenturret by Glenturret out there. It's owned by the Edrington Group since they bought Highland Distillers in 99-2000. So it's been around and it is available. It's just not very widely available. Most of it probably ends up in Edrington's blends, the majority of which is probably Famous Grass. So if you're a Famous Grass fan, and I'm sure they're out there, then you're probably more familiar with old Glenturret than you might think. It's not a big distillery, just over 300,000 litres, which is actually very, very small. That's pretty close to... what did you remind me of?
Edredora,
yeah, which is still, I think, the smallest distillery in all of Scotland. Discounting some of the very, very small, some of the, say, farm distilleries, the Kilomans and like. I think you want a smallest industrial distillery, as I suppose you could call them. So this one, pretty niche stuff, really, and certainly a malt that's made to blend rather than anything in particular. But as we found in the past, they can produce some of the most sublime aged whisky out there. There's whisky that starts off very normal and ends up far, far from it. So we'll see if this is one of those. Matured in a hogshead, it's not going to tell us whether it was a sherry or a bourbon. It's one of these whiskies that's right on the end, right on the edge of where it's either quite an active bourbon cask or quite a subdued sherry. So we'll just have to make a bet as we taste it.
I've seen older bourbon matured whisky which was a paler colour than this, but at the same time it's relatively bright for a sherry whisky of this age. But yeah, we'll see. Either way, quite an active hogshead. This is cask strength, but it's only 51.1%. And there are only 183 bottles produced from that one hoggy.
So they didn't get a lot out of it, but 51% not a bad strength for almost 30 years old.
Yeah.
Certainly nowhere near the danger zone of 40%. A cask that probably could have quite easily gotten to 40 years old if it had been given that longer run. However,
big florals and honey sweetness.
Hugely, hugely sweet. Sweet before and more than just about anything else. There's really, really huge runny honey. If you've had the sort of liquid clover honey, that's this all over. And very, very floral, as Dave says. There's a lot of sort of honeysuckle. There's gorse flower, if you're familiar with it. What do they call that in the old country? Windbush, I think. Windbushes. More of a thing and less of a pest than it is over here. It grows rather too well down in New Zealand. But anyway, windbushes, they have a particular sort of buttery sweet scent and very subtle, and that is in here to no small extent.
A lot of thick, viscous oils coating the inside of the glass.
It smells like a thick whiskey. It's a very, very weighty nose. There's no small amount of fiery spirit on there as well. It's not a whiskey that shows its age particularly. It's still quite got a lot of vibrancy and youthful characteristics.
I could happily spend a long time just smelling that, but I want to know what it tastes like too.
Just the last couple of things from the nose before we dig our tongues in. There is a lot of wax. Quite a lot of wax. And just a little bit of scented soap. Creamy scented soap right on the end. And that, I think, just about rounds off the nose. Let's see what's on the palate at full strength.
Wow. Yeah. It is bursting with thick, oily honey sweetness. It's positively syrupy in almost more like a literal syrup. Profoundly sweet, almost like a fruit nectar.
It's almost like a whiskey reduction.
Yeah.
It's really, really concentrated. And it's almost so sweet that the sweet, unctuous, syrupy goodness is so powerful that it actually gets in ahead of the hot alcohol. Normally you put something, more than 50% alcohol by volume in your mouth, the first and dominant thing you're going to get is the heat, the burn from that aggressive quantity of alcohol. But in this case, that comes entirely secondary to this real dollop of sweetness which comes with it.
And that finish is pure liquid honey with maybe a touch of walnut and almond. That's really quite remarkable. Blimey, I'd probably say I've never had a whiskey of that kind of heavy, syrupy texture before. It's so thick.
I think the way to describe it is a little goes a long way. You can take the tiniest sip and it just sort of blooms across the mouth and you get huge quantities of flavour for the sort of little, like the 1 mil that you're actually imbibing. It has huge quantities of flavour, and that's really nice to see. I wish I could make a more reasoned bet as to sherry or bourbon, but it's very juicy, but it does also have vanilla and honey sweetness and all these sort of things. So it's kind of straddling in between.
Personally, I'd be veering toward sherry. There's just so much extra sweetness, not the kind of vanilla oaky sweetness we're used to from bourbon, and the colour and the oiliness there, that speaks to me of a sherry matured whiskey. But that's just my...
I'm not ready to make a call until I put some water in with it, but it's almost bringing to mind that sneaky cask of Bunnahabhain we tasted recently that had in fact been re-racked into a sherry after spending most of its life in a bourbon hogshead. So I'm not saying that that's what's happened here, but it brings to mind that, in that it sort of straddles both frames of flavour. So put a wee drizzle in here and see how that changes it. And that's really calmed the spirit down and made it significantly more waxy, which is interesting. It's really quite... I said sort of scented soap earlier. Now it's almost like a scented candle.
There's
quite uncannily like a scented candle.
Climnish happening on the nose now.
No small amount whatsoever. I think this is probably the first Glenturret I've ever had, so I have no profile for it whatsoever in my mind. But I'd have to say, if this is remotely indicative, then it is a very Clynelish-y sort of a whiskey. Yeah. They're not particularly proximate, despite both being Highlands. This is more neighbour to Aberfeldy, I think, than any other particular distillery, if that tells you anything. But who knows?
Ooh. That has turned into a tropical fruity sorbet. Passion fruit and mangoes, a little bit of a lemony zing to it.
This has turned into, funny enough, almost classically old Speyside rather than necessarily Highland, but as I've said before, the definition is nebulous at best. This is like the, you said sorbet. Yeah. For me, it's like a tinned fruit salad. That's almost slightly artificially sweet. It's the difference between fresh fruit and fruit that comes in a can which says in heavy syrup, which I don't think you can even buy in New Zealand anymore. I think heavy syrup was just too naughty for us. I think it's light syrup or nothing. But back in the day, and I'm sure still in Europe and the UK, you can get things in heavy syrup, as God intended, and that has a particular smell, which this one reminds me of. It's sort of tinned pear, tinned apple, even a little bit of tinned pineapple coming through, and it's something you get with old floral honey Speyside whiskey, and I think it's quite fabulous. It's quite an old-fashioned flavour as well.
Whereas I get more of the light but sharp and acidic tones, like you get from, again, a sorbet that's got a lot of very strong fruit.
This has sort of brought the more acidic properties of the fruit out, whereas before it was... This is, in both ways, a very mouth-watering whiskey. You know you've got quite a good whiskey when you just get all kinds of just a saliva party going on your mouth once you have a sip. Always a good sign. Probably a slightly disgusting way to describe it, but always a good sign for me. And this one has always had that effect on me, but for two different reasons. When it was at its full strength, it was like that from the sheer sort of syrupy sweetness. And now, with that little bit of dilution, it's similarly mouth-watering, but because of these significantly tangier fruits which have surfaced.
So a little more water, and now it's kind of a luscious mango punch.
As we've seen with so many single casks of this ilk, it's a whiskey that has really two different sides and two completely different almost ways to enjoy it. Usually I like one or the other. This one I think is almost equally good. It kind of just depends what you're after. This is maybe more of a refreshing, enlivening, vitalising whiskey, whereas it's certainly more of a dessert format, undiluted.
Yeah, it's sort of transforming with the addition of water, but not getting better or worse as it goes.
In either respect, it's really quite stunning. It's a whiskey that I wish I could taste more of, and two things prevent me from doing this. One is obviously price. I just can't afford to go walking out the door and buy terribly old whiskey every day. And secondarily, it's very rare to see these sort of lesser known niche distilleries like this put out old whiskey, because usually they don't. You have to wait for an independent bottle to come along. And in this case, goodness, how many did we get? 183. That's not a hell of a lot of bottles, considering how many people there are in the world. I mean, goodness knows, not everyone's a whiskey aficionado, but still, 183, that's a very small number. If there was 183 bottles in New Zealand alone, that might cater for New Zealand's whiskey community. Everyone that wanted one could probably get one. Multiply that by the population of the earth, and you've got a real big supply problem. I think Signatory, in this case, understands that, because I know for a fact that this is one in a sort of a series of old Glenturrets that they've brought out. So they're doing their best to make sure it's maybe not the same whiskey is totally available, because it's never going to be, while still being a single cask, but this was one of, I think, maybe even 3 or 4 30 years-ish Glenturrets that they released sort of back-to-back, because Whiskey Galore had another one of them. So they've done very well for their particular allocation this time. But so you might not be able to find this one exactly as it exists, but if you do a little look around, you may find old Signatory Glenturret that might not be necessarily dissimilar. But if you find this exact bottling, then you can take my word for the fact that it's a 94. It's a really stellar whiskey. What do you think?
93 for me. Exceptional stuff. Sweet, Highlandy, with a unique, cloying, honey-like, oozing sugariness to it.
It really is one of the best whiskies we've had this year. And we're halfway through now, so that's an increasingly high bar for whiskies to reach. But if you're at all a fan of, I'd say almost like the floral lighter Highland or Speyside, this one is a really solid recommendation from us.
If you like the heavy, chewy, gooey sweet Highland, then this is also going to cater to your taste.
Really magnificent stuff. Really glad I got to try this one. I just wish people turned 30 every day so I'd have more of an excuse, but never mind. We'll just have to wait a few years till we'll start turning 40 and things will get really expensive, so we'll look forward to that. We'll start saving now, shall we? Alright, this was the Single Malt Review. Thank you for sticking with us. We will be right back with something else. Sláinte.